From Raleigh, North Carolina, welcome to Firing Line. I'm Michael Kinsley of the New Republic magazine. The big buzzword in education these days is choice. The idea is that parents should get to choose what schools their children attend instead of being assigned to one by the local school bureaucracy. Schools would have to compete for students, and competition, in the good old American fashion, would produce results. That's the theory. There are two versions of choice. One that's actually being tried around the country gives parents a choice among various public schools. A more radical version would allow any school, public or private, to participate and to get government funds. The radical version was recently endorsed in a report by the Brookings Institution, generally considered to be liberal. Critics of the choice concept ask whether the students who need help most would get left behind when schools are free to take kids they want. They also raise church-state separation questions if the government aid is available to religious schools. Kate O'Byrne is Deputy Director of Domestic Studies at the Heritage Foundation, the conservative think tank. She was in the Department of Health and Human Services under Ronald Reagan. Cy Fliegel is the Gilder Education Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, another conservative think tank. He is former superintendent in the New York City public school system. Mr. Buckley, the problem with the radical choice system, it seems to me, isn't that students get to choose the schools, but that the schools get to choose the students. Wouldn't this inevitably lead to the better students being skimmed off, leaving the really troubled ones, the ones who need help the most, behind? And wouldn't this especially be true unless you had a rule forbidding parents to top up how much each school would pay? Otherwise, you're just going to end up subsidizing Choate and St. Paul's for the students who would get in there anyway.
I'm glad that Michael went into that subject, because I think it's one that ought to be accosted early on. Namely, the concern has been over the student who can't perform or who is sluggish in his performance. And the notion, as I see it, is that you got to mix them up with a peer model who causes him to perform better. But just as you can perhaps hypothetically damage the one set of students, you can also hypothetically damage the other set of students, the people who aren't given a demanding enough curriculum. Oughtn't we to change the emphasis from the one to the other? That is to say, oughtn't we to say, help everybody who's upwardly mobile to the extent that you can, even if you acknowledge that there are going to be some people who are left behind? Or is neither one of you willing to make that concession?
I am uncomfortable with the underlying argument that says, how does choice respond to the needs of disadvantaged students? We can't dismantle public schools and allow other parents to have choice. We have to, in a sense, hold all children hostage in a failing public school system rather than let some escape.
Yeah.
And I'm very uncomfortable with that notion. It's never been the way, frankly, and, you know, the generations of Americans have advanced. It has been individuals at a time. There are choice schemes that could be, especially with the private, including private schools, that could be designed to take care of specifically a child who might need extra assistance. You could have an enriched voucher, for instance, the Brookings plan.
What?
An enriched voucher. You could have a more valuable voucher for a child who needs special assistance or special education, for instance. And the plan advanced most recently by the Brookings Institution, their plan allowed exactly that. You thereby have an incentive for certain schools to form to specifically cater to children who might have different needs that might not mix in with a student body of a different ability. You could make these modifications and have plans responsive to the needs of all students. The impetus being that schools were competing for that business, had every reason to succeed.
Well, how do you handle that problem, Ms. Fliegel?
Well, in East Harlem, which certainly is a poor economic community, we didn't have that problem. We worked on the premise that almost all youngsters can be educated and almost all youngsters can learn. And what we tried to do is we accepted a basic assumption: there's no one best school for everyone. So in East Harlem, what we did was we set up 52 schools and 20 school buildings that in effect said to youngsters, to teachers, and to parents, we're interested in what you're interested in, and we want to cater a school that will be motivational for you, that will make you feel it's your school, so that we took in all the youngsters. We did not leave out any poor youngsters. And I don't know if you understand, remember the history of District 4? Briefly, in 1973-74, it ranked 32 out of 32 school districts in New York City. It was the bottom in every category you can imagine. By 1981, it ranked 16th. In 1973-74, 10 to 12 youngsters got into the specialized high schools. New York City specialized high schools are really the good high schools in public education. By 1981, 200 and more got into it. So our premise is that you can educate all these youngsters and that you don't have to make a choice of leaving out some and letting others fail.
Well, how do you handle the argument of opponents of the voucher system who say, look, let's say you got a district with 20 schools, and each school, in attempting to attract the brightest students, offers this or that perquisite, intellectual perquisite, academic perquisite. And in accepting these students, they've got to exclude some. And so therefore you have 1,000 students left over. And where do you find schools for them? Now, in the Brookings study, or in Manhattan study, it would, at that point, assign students to schools that had spaces. Is that right?
No, but basically, in District 4, 90 to 95% of the youngsters got either the first, second, or third choice. So we were left with a small percentage of youngsters.
What about them?
Those youngsters, we went back to those schools, and we said, so you have to be honest with professionals. You don't tell professionals, we have a youngster with tremendous potential. Unfortunately, he's killing the youngsters in the present school. You tell him that this is a difficult youngster, but he wants to attend your school, and we want you to give him a shot at it. And once they understood that you weren't stuck with that youngster, when you have that kind of flexibility, you can move a youngster out of it.
He's probationary, so.
Yes, right. And they would take him, and they would be so proud to come tell me, you know that youngster you thought was so difficult? I got 15 much worse than him. He's doing exceptionally well in the school. So that there was a place for every youngster in East Harlem. There was no such thing as a youngster not getting into a school.
Well, what about the guy who does make out, who does kill people?
Well, you see, New York City has one of the largest special ed educational systems in the world, I suspect. We thought it would be fair that after trying, say, one or two of the alternatives we had, if a youngster still couldn't make it, then that's a proper placement for a youngster into special education. But certainly we prevented an awful lot of youngsters from being placed in special ed because they weren't doing well where they were.
Well, when you say 14 out of 15, is that a faithful reflection of the numbers who have made it over against those who don't make it?
Well, I would have to say this. In 73, 74, 15-point-something% of the youngsters read at above grade level. By 80, 81, we were up to 65%. Now, that is a dramatic change. That's not a simple change.
That's a dramatic change, yeah.
That is a dramatic change. And I think it's a fair evaluation of a system to say, where do your kids go? If you're an elementary and junior high system, what high schools do they get into? And I think we did exceptionally well in that. In fact, we also set up 2 high schools in the district, which in New York City you don't control high schools. The central board does. But we set up 2 of them, and both are doing exceptionally well. One is the Math and Science School, you know New York City, Benjamin Franklin High School along the drive there, had the distinction of graduating 7% of its entering youngsters. That means 93% of the youngsters didn't get out. And on any given day, the attendance in the morning was 44%. No one had the courage to take it in the afternoon. We took that school over from the central board. 4 years later, we put in 2 of our alternative elementary and junior high and in high school. 4 years later, 100% graduated, 100% went on to college. So those are dramatic changes. And what I'm trying to say to you is meaningful change can take place under the most difficult of situations.
Well, were there any casualties of that operation?
I'm sure there were some casualties.
The ego of the education establishment was badly bruised.
Yeah, I suppose it was.
Right.
But were there any casualties of teenage casualties?
Well, you know, we don't really know because the kids who go to the other high schools, we don't have follow-up on them. We were able to follow up the youngsters in our own 2 high schools. So I'm sure there are casualties. There are a lot of circumstances that lead to those casualties. But they got the best shot they could get.
Yeah. Well, let me ask a couple of basic questions. How would a school go about within a district advertising its specially desired curriculum or modus operandi? How would Mrs. Jones, who is dissatisfied with the progress of her son, know to go to your school?
Very interesting question. Usually it's not as polite as your question. Usually is how can these poor parents make good decisions, is what I usually hear. And interestingly enough, we had to triplicate a good school. We never closed a good school, and we closed 2 very poor schools. So people know about schools. It's not the mystique we make it out to be. For example, I think most youngsters, if you go into a school and ask youngsters, who are the best teachers in the school? I think they'd be right around 90% of the time. Principal most probably 88%, so it's not a significant difference between those two. But it's not a mystique. And first of all, we had a program where we sent materials to parents. Then we had orientation sessions. Then we trained teachers in the 6th grade on teaching youngsters how to make good decisions. Then we had meetings where parents could come in and see the schools, so that you can set up an information system that makes parents aware of what the choices are. It is not as difficult as people make it out to seem.
In a sense, we have to recognize that this has been going on for some time. I mean, among more affluent families, they choose schools all the time. You know, they're able to move to certain neighborhoods that have a reputation of having good schools. They can choose among private schools. What's revolutionary, and I guess threatening now to the education establishment, is many of us are arguing that low-income families should have the same choices that, frankly, other Americans have always had, and have been perfectly competent about making those decisions with respect to where to live, or whether or not a school is so bad that one wants to use an alternative private school.
So having decided this particular school is desirable, then all of a sudden the applications for matriculation in it multiply, right? And instantly the situation gets out of hand. It becomes, if you like, the Harvard of this particular district. So therefore, what do? Do you wait for another school to get an equivalent reputation?
No. It always amazes me. People always ask that question. We do a very difficult thing. We create Central Park East 2. And if Central Park East 2 does well, we open up River East 1. What it does, it tells you what kind of education parents want, what kinds of schools are functioning. So it's not as difficult as, again, as people make it out to seem. Now, it's true.
But how do you find the qualified personnel in the numbers in which you want them?
Well, see, one of the things that we do when we talk about alternative education is what we're really doing is extending ownership. And we're extending ownership to dreamers or to people who have visions or missions. My conservative friends seem to only like goals. They'll give you goals, you know. But for whom that is clear. And we put them into business, in effect. Now, there are people out there in the present systems who, given that kind of climate, come forward. See, in District 4, we go from having the progressive schools of Deborah Meyer to what would be the equivalent of a parochial school, public jackets and blazers and skirts and so on, so that there's enough choices there so that people can get philosophically hooked up with that school. And we get people coming from all over wanting to come into East Hall, teachers.
Well, let me ask you this question then. Given the assumption that there are teachers there in sufficient quantity, of sufficient quality, to man the schools under this reformed perspective, why are these same teachers so frightened? Do you have an answer to that?
Currently, in the status quo,
Yeah.
they're working for an enormous bureaucracy with total power over themselves, over them as individuals and professionals. The current system can't reward good teachers and can't punish bad teachers. A system like this should be able to, frankly. Excellent teachers ought to be able to prosper by being good teachers, and the bad teachers ought to be let go. We, of course, support the full-blown voucher system. And we also, of course, in favor of alternative certification. You know, there's no teacher shortage. There's only, if it exists in pockets, shortages of traditionally certified teachers. And which is, we've all seriously questioned whether or not we're preparing, the current mode of preparing teachers makes for the sort of quality teachers we want. So we think the full-blown voucher system, which would allow parents and students to choose among all varieties of schools, for schools to compete, would attract alternatively certified teachers into that environment. It'd be creative. They'd be able to, they'd be responsible as professionals. They'd be held accountable. They wouldn't be protected. They wouldn't have the ironclad job security they now have. But many teachers would trade that in order to be rewarded.
Okay, without Ms. Fliegel, in the situation that you experienced, how did you remove the teachers who were not carrying their load?
Oh, it's one of the advantages of being in New York City is a large system. And you can negotiate all kinds of things with folks. So if we had a teacher in one of our alternative schools, because don't forget, they chose the schools. The teachers, and as well as the youngsters, chose the schools. So if the teacher wasn't working out, first our obligation is to help them become better teachers. Let's say that doesn't work. You negotiate it out with them. You say, listen, this may be the wrong place for you. And there were enough places for them to go. Now, I'm not overjoyed. I'm not saying we got them out of teaching. But I'm a small thinker. We were happy to take care of District 4 at that time. You can negotiate folks out. Then there's processes for getting rid of unsatisfactory teachers. They're difficult and long, but you can do it.
Do they in New York have tenure?
Yes. Oh, more than tenure. It's very difficult. You can have an unsatisfactory teacher for a number of years.
How did you handle that problem?
Well, as I said, we either let them know that they could do better elsewhere, and we actually tried to help them do better elsewhere. And some of them did do better elsewhere.
They frequently become bureaucrats, don't they? I mean, there are 4,000 bureaucrats running New York City high schools, and I suspect many of them had maybe flunked in the classroom, but the system maintained its loyalty, and they're now bureaucrats running the school system.
But in fairness to those bureaucrats, having been one of them myself, the truly unsatisfactory teachers aren't the ones who move up. They were usually good teachers, because the only reward, so to speak, was to get out of the classroom. That's what's wrong with the system. That's who you reward. But there are ways, there are due process methods of getting rid of terrible teachers. We don't get rid of enough of them, but that's what we did. We did not have as big a problem with that, because to start with, we got teachers who were happy to be where they were, and they were excited, and there were all kinds of people who want to fulfill prophecies. And in fact, we really exploited teachers. Most of our directors were teachers who had a dream, and all we gave them was the possibility to carry out the dream. And I tend not to concentrate on the poor teacher, but rather getting those teachers. Move everyone up one notch. Let's make the poor teacher mediocre. The mediocre good, the good teacher excellent. Again, I have simple taste.
Yeah, I don't want to sound like an obstinate dissenter here. I'm trying to ask some of the questions that I acknowledge and you confirm do get asked all the time. But one of the questions that citizens have to ask themselves is, where are the power centers here? We are told simultaneously that the thing the Americans want most is an improvement in the education of children. And then you are told that, however, this isn't possible because the educational bureaucracy is impenetrable. Now, how can they hold out? How can they exercise the kind of power that evidently they do against a mobilized class of parents? I'm asking a question.
Yeah, we've seen it state after state. About roughly half of states either have some sort of a public choice plan, if not statewide, at least within school districts, or are contemplating one. We've seen in a couple of other states, reformers bypass the state committees on education, which tend to be bastions of the education establishment. In Oregon this year, there's a citizen-inspired initiative on the ballot.
Do you predict that the good guys will win?
I'm cautiously optimistic. The education establishment, of course, will throw everything they have against it because it will provide public school open enrollment throughout the state, tuition tax credits for all private schools, and tuition tax credit for homeschoolers. So, I mean, it's a very dramatic proposal in a not very typical state in many respects. As I said, we're cautiously optimistic, but they had to go to the grassroots ballot initiative method in order to allow the voters. The polls tell us time and time again, American parents want choice in education, but things get bottlenecked in those Senate and Assembly committees.
On the other hand, you can't allow the bureaucracy to become an excuse for not doing anything. You see, there are many schools that say, look, we can't do anything because the bureaucrats won't allow us. We didn't accept that. And we developed what I term a creative noncompliance approach. We complied with those things that we thought were meaningful, with those things that were not. We just didn't comply with them in a very creative way. So that you can do things. See, I just can't accept that, you know, too many schools say I can't do it. The bureaucracy won't let me do it. The unions won't let me do it. And then what are you doing here? I mean, you have to be able to do these things within that. Now, I think what's happening in education today is there's some very good things beginning to happen. This concept of school site autonomy and school site decision making. It's a good idea. I think that we did that in East Harlem way back in '74 going on. But with that, I say to professionals, you can have all the autonomy you want. I think schools should make the decisions what's going on. But we need an accountability mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just give the parents a little thing. Say, I'm not one of these guys who think the parents should run the schools. It doesn't work that way. There are a lot of things, and poor parents have a lot of trouble surviving, let alone run the schools. But let's give the parents that little piece of accountability. They can select whether we go to your school or not. That motivates professionals give them all the autonomy they need. I think that's an important aspect. I think choice is also a catalyst for school improvement. It's certainly not a panacea. You know, I've always argued that. I've never met anyone except for my friend John Chubb. John Chubb is the first person in the history of the world who ever used panacea in a positive way. So everyone says not a panacea. I agree it's not a panacea. But it is a catalyst and a mechanism for accountability that is very strong, and can work wonders in terms of what happens in schools. Mm-hmm. So I'm optimistic about what's going to happen.
What about the apparent conflict between those blacks who are members of the underclass, whose apparent spokesmen are mobilized against this, and such evidence as Paula Williams, who led the fight in Milwaukee in favor of choice? Is there an internal argument within the black community about this? Because if we are to believe your researchers, the city underprivileged stand to benefit the most from these particular reforms. Is that correct? Now, is this a hard fact to communicate convincingly?
Polly Williams has told me directly that there is no such conflict among low-income black families.
That they're all on your side?
That they virtually all support what she was able to do in Milwaukee, which was the 1,000 vouchers for low-income black kids to go to these traditional black primary schools. She criticizes the so-called civil rights movement as being out of step with the needs of low-income black families and not representing what they really want, which is choice. She said that she was an anti-busing advocate years ago. Yeah. She didn't want her children bused across town. She wanted a good school in her own neighborhood. Yeah. So she makes the point that those so-called spokespeople who mounted a lawsuit against her and her low-income black families don't in any way represent those families.
Well, how would say Jesse Jackson? Has he opined on this question? I
have not heard an opinion from Jesse Jackson, although Polly Williams was Jesse Jackson's state chairman in both '84 and '88 in Wisconsin. She considers herself a liberal Democrat, but when it comes to the education issues and what she's been seeing firsthand among low-income black kids in Milwaukee, she parts ways with her liberal friends and found allies, of course, among the conservatives in Wisconsin, including the Republican governor.
To what extent is there a mobilized secularist or, say, anti-church lobby involved in this struggle?
To a fair extent. When reformers have tried to push the choice movement to include those secular schools, one still comes up against it, certainly.
The Americans for Atheism or whatever.
That's right.
They call
That's
this,
right.
And what kind of power do they have? Do they intimidate by use of the First Amendment?
Well, they're part of a coalition in Oregon, of course, because the state tax credit on the Oregon ballot can be used in sectarian schools also. The Supreme Court First Amendment law, of course, is certainly confusing, but the weight of opinion now seems to be that tax credits are constitutional, and that if a carefully crafted choice bill that includes religiously affiliated schools would probably be upheld, although it has to be carefully. As long as there's an intermediary between, that's right, between the state and the religious institution.
Then it becomes more like the GI Bill.
That's right. But those, the ACLU and those of their ilk are active in the coalition in Oregon against the ballot initiative, the choice initiative.
Is there the same problem in New York City, Ms. Fliegel?
No, New York City, First, let me respond to your first question about the opposition. Most people, this audience included, believe in choice and have exercised it. So the conversation really is, should poor folks have choice? Because you decide choice in schools by where you live and where you work and so on. So I've never met anyone who's against a choice for themselves. It's always a choice for someone else that someone objects to. And for example, I usually give the haircut example. When I need a haircut, I live in Queens. I get in my car, I drive to the Bronx, where I used to live, to get a haircut. If someone said to me, no, you have to get a haircut in your neighborhood, I could take them to court on that. But you see, a haircut's a serious matter. And it's a funny thing.
15 seconds.
Okay. In New York City, we don't have that issue. In New York City, we have an issue. It's interesting. You people think that we're going to have vouchers tomorrow. It's not happening. We're not getting public school choice tomorrow. There's a big battle against public school choice. What they use are the arguments about segregation and separation of churches. That is an argument, but that's for public school choice.
Thank you, Ms. Fliegel. Thank you, Mr. Barron. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Kinsley.
Funding for Firing Line was made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the A.J. Fletcher Foundation, Raleigh, North Carolina, making a difference in the arts, education, and broadcasting. By the Mobile Corporation, L. John Polite, Jr., the Friends of Firing Line, and by the financial support of viewers like you. This program was produced by SECA, which is solely responsible for its content. For a printed bound transcript of this program, send $3 to